All right, we are going to get started on time. Thank you all for coming. My name is Garth Spellman. I'm the curator of ornithology, and I'm standing in for Paula, who is absent and in the field today. And it is my pleasure on this happy tropical Tuesday, everyone who's got tropical shirts on, right, to introduce our curator of geology. And I'm not going to spend much time introducing him because he needs no introduction. Dr. James Hagadorn. He's going to talk about our newest mass extinction in Colorado, which I assume means the one we're currently living through. Is that true?
Could be.
Okay, we're going to have to find out, I guess.
You got to stay awake to the end of the talk. Thanks, everyone. So a few years ago, I moved to Colorado, and I got a job at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And we had this thing called voicemail. We also had telephones on our desk that had cords on them. I know some of you guys still have those. But one of the very first messages I got at this museum was from a guy named Bruce Shoemaker, and he left this message for me, and it said, "Hello, Dr. Hagadorn. This is Bruce Shoemaker here. I'm for the U.S. Forest Service, and we have a situation here in the Flat Tops, and I need you to call me back right away about it. Okay?" He left his number. Yeah, welcome to Colorado. So what do you think the first thing I did was? I mean, now that I was in trouble with the feds, at least that was going on in my mind. What was the first thing I did? No, I didn't call him back. I went to a map and looked up where the heck are the flat tops, right? Right? So flat tops are all over. So the flat tops are just north of Glenwood Canyon in the White River Uplift. So I looked that up and I called him back. And it turns out Bruce Shoemaker was a fantastic guy. And he was just calling me because there were a bunch of community scientists that had been working up in the flat tops collecting fossils from these incredible outcrops, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about today, that are about 360 million years old. And they'd gotten so curious about collecting all these fossils that they realized they wanted to go a little bit beyond that and actually do some science and start characterizing them and describing them. And Bruce really just wanted to connect with the museum and connect me to them so that they could reposit their materials there and we could get a permit and do it legally rather than sort of doing it on the side. So it actually has turned into a great collaboration, and like many things in science, it's serendipity, right? A lot of people don't sort of start a scientific project with forming a hypothesis and then going through the methodology and testing it and writing it up and the like. So today I want to tell you a little bit about that story. It's turned into a great collaboration with lots of folks that are, some of which are in this room, fellow scientists, community scientists, park rangers, folks from all over. And so if I say I in this talk too much, what I really mean is me. This is a team effort. We've published 5 papers on this. So far, we've got 2 more in the mill, and I'm very grateful to everyone's involvement in this project. So we're going to start out here, Glenwood Canyon. How many of you guys have been to Glenwood Canyon before? Okay, how many of you have driven through Glenwood Canyon with a geologist and lived, right? Okay, this is what a geologist shouldn't be doing when they're driving through Glenwood Canyon, because there's all these amazing rocks, right? And these rocks are basically kind of like reading the pages of a book or the layers of a tree, tree rings, in that all of these layers are the moments in time. And so today we're going to focus on some rocks that are exposed in Glenwood Canyon and nearby, right up in here, a rock unit called the Dyer Formation, D-Y-E-R. And I know some of you have probably been on field trips to that before. We've got an amazing collection of fossils now and rocks from this interval. And I want to just kind of place this into context. So one of the things geologists do is we think about these layers of sedimentary rocks which are horizontal. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a few pictures through these sedimentary rocks later in this talk. But I'm going to, for the moment, take this column of rock, and for the first time ever, I'm going to turn Glenwood Canyon, ching, on its side, right? And I'm going to lay out with different colors the different types of rocks that we just saw in that picture here. This is called a graphic log. And today we're going to focus in on this rock unit called the Dyer Formation, which forms in the Devonian period. And one of the reasons why I ended up working on the flat tops for so long for the last few years isn't just because it's right next to my mother-in-law's house, which it is. That's another story. But because when I was out on these outcrops the first time with all these community scientists, they had all these incredible fossils. And one of the things they noted was that these fossils sort of disappeared higher in the section. The rocks became unfossiliferous. They were barren. They were just layered. There was nothing in them, no evidence of life. And I remember asking Jim Bullocks when I first moved here and he took me up to the flat tops, I was like, well, roughly what age are these? He's like, oh, they're Devonian. I was like, well, when in the Devonian? He's like, well, they're kind of late Devonian. And I said, did you know that at the end of the Devonian is one of the largest, it's the second largest mass extinction event in all of Earth history, larger than the KPG or the KT? Is it possible that the disappearance of all those amazing fossils that you've been collecting for 20 years is related to that? wow, that could be a pretty cool story. What if Colorado not only has an amazing record of the KT or the KPG, but also of the end Devonian event? So we decided to kind of explore that. But in order to kind of think about these things, we need to think about the context of the Earth at that time, right? Because Colorado wasn't in isolation. So if we think about what's happening in the world at that time, tectonically, it is boring in Colorado. There's no Rocky Mountains, there's no ancestral Rockies, there's no Himalayas coming up. It's a pretty quiet time. When we think about where was Colorado, this is a plot of where Colorado has been for the last 500 million years. It's been on a journey covering the globe in different places due to plate tectonics. Colorado was tropical in the late Devonian. We were actually south of the equator. Isn't that cool to think about Colorado having been tropical, being Tropical Tuesday, of course, most of our history? It's only now that we have these like damn ice caps and all this other stuff, right? So Colorado was tropical. Tectonically, there was not a lot going on. And the other thing is that sea level was relatively high. So used to see is a fancy geological word for relative sea level. So sea level was a bit higher than now. So the ocean didn't lap up in what today is California. It lapped up all the way and bathed Colorado and many of the Midwestern states. The other thing that's happening is in the world at the time is that we do have some ice caps forming. And those ice caps, which today are at the North and South Pole, have the tendency to basically take water out of the ocean or redistribute that water back in the ocean. And when ice caps melt, the ocean's level rises and it bathes continental interiors like where we are today. And when ice caps form, they basically drain, if you will, the oceans of a lot of their water, and sea level lowers. And so this is a time period to think about Colorado as basically rather flat, sometimes flooded, sometimes not, and tropical. That's the kind of context in which we're going to be thinking about the rocks we're going to look at today. So here's what the Dyer Formation looks like. This is a vertical section right near Glenwood Canyon at a place called Bearscat Creek. It's largely a bunch of rocks called limestones and dolastones, which are basically made out of minerals very similar to what clamshells secrete to build their skeletons. Many of you have seen this unit elsewhere. It's called the Red Wall Limestone. It caps the Grand Canyon. This caps almost all the cliffs in Colorado. This is what Glenwood Caverns, Cave of the Winds, and a lot of other major cave deposits form in here in Colorado. So you may have even been near this rock in the past, but not known it. So we're going to focus on a unit of rock called the Dyer Formation, and we're going to look at a bunch of data and outcrops from areas just north of Glenwood Canyon up here in the Flat Tops or White River Uplift area. Okay, we've got a bunch of different localities here, and as a geologist, we like to think about going through the layers of time, but paleontologists, we also think about, well, how could we see what those environments look like? How could we walk across that ancient landscape and see what it was like, whether it was a desert or a stream, or how could we scuba dive across the seafloor in deep time? And one of the great things about this area is that in deep canyons there, you can see the sides of the rocks and get that vertical succession through time. But in places like this, up on the flat tops, there are outcrops where you can follow an individual bedding surface for a half a kilometer or so, which is a bit like taking a walk on an ancient beach. And it allows you to see how those environments and the creatures that lived in them changed across a gradient. And so what I want to do is kind of walk you through a bunch of pictures of these rocks going from the bottom of the Dyer Formation going to the top. And yeah, that's my boot. You ever wonder why geologists are always taking pictures of their rock hammers and their hand lenses and their Swiss Army knives and their thumbs? Oh wait, those are just scale bars, right? But we're going to take a look at a bunch of these rocks. So right beneath the Dyer Formation is a rock unit that has cross-bedding in it and a bunch of fish teeth and plates like this that was basically deposited in an ancient beach, right? So that's the setting that existed just prior to the Dyer Formation being deposited. The Dyer Formation, by the way, I'm going to refer to this column over here. This is called a graphic log or a measured section. I'm going to show you where information I'm sharing with you today comes from within that section as we go from older to younger rocks and thus from more ancient time to more recent time. So most of the Dyer Formation is made up of this knobbly bedded nodular limestone, right? Pretty dang ugly, huh? In fact, the Forest Service makes quarries of this up there that they grind up for road gravel because the rock naturally breaks up into a bunch of little parts. So these have lots of structures in them that indicate they were deposited in a shallow marine carbonate setting, very much like the Bahamas or the Great Barrier Reef or something like that. And if we take a look at what's in them besides the grains of sediment themselves, it's actually full of fossils. It's got burrows of worms and other arthropods that lived in the bottom. It's got syringoporid corals like that one at the upper right. It's got armored plates and bones of large fish, like, Dunkleosteus or Donkey, the big, huge placoderm fish that's up in prehistoric Journey. It's got spines in it that are from the pectoral fins, if you will, of large shark-like creatures that probably could have, maybe bitten the end of your nose off if it was this close. These things could be, almost several meters in length. It's got all sorts of things like weird things like a conularid, an early relative of a jellyfish or a coral, clams, worms, bryozoans, which are kind of like feather creatures that live on the seafloor, shells of coiled organisms similar to snails. And then, anybody seen one of these before? This is a fully articulated sponge with all of its spiny little spicules. I had never seen a sponge in the field before I came, in the ancient, I should say, in the field before I came to Colorado. And that's because most sponges disarticulate or break into a million little parts and when they die shortly thereafter, and you're only left with their little spines. You never see the whole thing together. So this deposit, no wonder the Western Interior Paleontological Society and everybody and their brother had been going up there to collect fossils. It's full of fossils, and it's not just fossils that suck, but fossils that are pretty awesome, right? And we have the critters that lived in the water column. We have the critters that were living fixed to the bottom or moving around on the bottom, and we even had the ones that are living in the mud. So you never get a census community when you go into deep time, but we have a window into different portions of of those communities to reconstruct what these environments are like. So if we move up section, we're moving a little bit higher in the Dire Formation. Notice the red arrows moving up. We've got a seafloor rich in invertebrate or non-backbone bearing life, including creatures like this one. This is a sea star. Here's its stomach averted right there. Pretty cool. Had never seen one of those before in the field myself. Brachiopods, which are kind of like weird clams. We've got orthocone nautiloids, which are like squid that cruised through the ancient seas. And again, I had never seen one of these before. Anyone know what this is? Crinoid, right? So this is an echinoderm. It's a cousin of sea stars and the like. And normally, again, this breaks into a million little puka shell type pieces that get distributed on the seafloor, but it was intact. So we've got a pretty incredible diversity in here. Lots of vertebrates too. Lots of different types of teeth of fish and rays that would crush the invertebrates on the bottom or potentially eat them. In this deposit. So this is a reconstruction we put together a few years ago to get a sense of like, well, what was life during this, sort of Devonian Sea? And so this is a picture, a view of that we put together with Paul Weimer a few years ago. And it's accurate in every single aspect except there's no sound in the Devonian. And I wouldn't want to be a trilobite because you'd get trilobitten, right? I know we got some interns here working on trilobites, so thank you. So this is a sense of what life was like during the lower part of the Dire Formation. And this is the part where that big change occurs that community scientists had noted early on. And here's a big change in environments where you basically go to laminated or thinly bedded dolostones or rocks made up of small particles. And occasionally these things are burrowed up a little bit, but they're not full of macroscopic fossils that you can see with your eyeballs. They've got all sorts of weird sedimentary structures that geologists like me can interpret and tell you that they were being formed in really shallow marine settings with lots of high energy currents, typical of storms or typical of water that's only maybe a half a meter to a meter in depth, including all sorts of scours and soft sediment deformation. Higher in the section, and most of the rocks are just laminated or thinly bedded like this. And you'd be hard pressed to go out there with your rock hammer and spend a whole day and find a single fossil, right? And so it's as if life has disappeared. There's lots more evidence of that, but when we get to the top of the unit, the rocks start to get altered a little bit, and they actually get kind of grotty and grungy looking up here. This is the very top of the Dire Formation. And if we take a look at what seems to be this kind of wiggly lines in the side of the rocks here, take a close look at it, it's actually very coarse-grained quartz sand that's working its way into cracks into this otherwise limestone or sort of reef-like rock below it. And this is what geologists call karst or paleokarst. And so what's happened is the top of this rock unit has been exposed to air, and rainwater, which is naturally a little bit acidic, has dissolved part of it, and then sand from a beach environment, not unlike the one that I showed you in my very first slide down here with my boot on it, has worked its way into those cracks, right? So we've got a bunch of different evidences for water depths, for different types of environments, and for different types of abundances and styles of fossils in this deposit. So now we're going to put on our science hat, right? Let's form a hypothesis. Where do you think the extinction is in this succession? Where is the logical place for the mass extinction to be? Okay, everyone vote here. Raise your hand. Raise your hand. It's okay, I won't pick on you. I mean, I'm taking down names in the back. It's okay. How about right here? Okay, we got some. How about right here? Oh, no one. Okay, good. Well, let's see. So guess where we thought the extinction was? We thought, bing, bang, bong. It's got to be here, right? Well, I know you guys have never been wrong before, but we were badly wrong. So, but that's part of science, right? Is you make mistakes, you learn from them. You put out a hypothesis and you correct it. You realize, oh, that's the wrong one. So that doesn't work. So we went out here and we sort of gridded and mapped a lot of these surfaces and quantified where all these macroscopic fossils were. And we went and made sort of almost archaeology style or zoology style grids, and we mapped all these surfaces, and I want to share some of that data with you. So I'm going to show you a few plots like this. So any point that plots along this line means that there's basically no fossils, and any point that plots over here means that there's a lot of fossils. And sure enough, the lower part of the succession here has got lots of fossils visible, and there's nothing visible at the top, right? Which is why it's logical to place a mass extinction, or at least a hypothesis that it's there. But there are other types of fossils too. I showed you some earlier. Remember that burrowing I showed you that was disrupting that bedding? That's an evidence for life existing in an environment, but maybe it doesn't have a skeleton, or maybe it's not preserved. And so when we looked at burrowing in sediments, both from the tops of bedding surfaces as well as the sides, we actually found a lot of evidence for life flourishing in these environments after where we posited the mass extinction event had been. And sure enough, this is a plot. And actually, I'm going to just plot both of these. There are two different plots of types of burrowing. Again, lots of burrowing, not very much burrowing at all. And higher in the section, where these rocks seem to be lifeless and barren, there's actually a fair bit of evidence for churning up of sediments, which means that organisms are living there. Maybe they're not skeletonized, but they're happy. And sure enough, looking with your naked eyes on the outcrop isn't just enough. A lot of science people think, oh yeah, you go out in the field and then you write a paper. Well, doing field work is somewhere between 1% and 5% of the scientific process on a good day, right? And maybe everyone else's field work is different from that, right? Dave, you do a day of field work, write a paper, a day of field work, write a paper, right? Okay, well, that's not usually how it works. So we went back to the lab. We spent a lot of time in the lab. We sectioned up the rocks and looked under the microscope, and we found that we had missed tons of fossils in the field. Things like echinoderm plates higher in the section above where we thought there shouldn't be any. We found ostracods, which are little clam-shaped arthropods. We found calcospheres, which are basically types of algae related potentially to dinoflagellates. And of course, lots of poop. Burrows and pellets, right? Again, letting us know that life is persisting throughout this interval of rocks that previously had been described as abiogenic or basically barren. So we thought, gosh, how are we going to find this extinction? Well, it turns out that there are techniques for finding extinctions depending on what interval of time you're in and what environment. You want to use the appropriate clues at your detective scene, right? So one of the clues that's used in the Devonian to tell time are these little teeth-like structures called conodonts. That's the head of a pin right there. And what geologists have done over the years is they've taken these they've taken limestones and dolostones and they dissolve them in acid. And then what's left are the residues, or the stuff that doesn't dissolve, which are the phosphatic teeth, just like yours, that are left in the limestones of the creatures that were swimming around in the water column back in the day, right? That were left on the seafloor. So they dissolved all these, and they've put them together, and they figured out what these animals look like and how their jaws articulate. And that allows us to then use these to tell time and environments, right? And this is a sense of what a conodont, these are things that are called conodont, what the conodont apparatus or jaw looked like. But I kind of deprived you of sound earlier, right? You probably want to know what it sounded like when they ate, right? I do. Here you go. Ready? So paleontologists are really smart. We can find an individual dinosaur bone and tell you what color its feathers were. And we can also find an old tooth and tell you how it sounded, right? I love it. Well, maybe that's a little bit of extrapolation, and maybe conodonts didn't eat Cheetos or Doritos or whatever. But, you know, the good thing is that we can name all these things, and scientists have done that. We figured out the succession of which they occur, how they articulate, and they've come up with a scheme for sort of dividing up time in these rocks. And so we thought we'd go do that. But we talked to this guy who was a very senior geologist who'd worked on these rocks a long time ago, and he said, you don't need to bother doing that because I've already looked for conodonts in those rocks, and they're only conodonts in the bottom part of this section. You're not going to find any up there. And I don't know if I'm stubborn or stupid or maybe a combination of both, but we thought, well, let's just look anyways, right? And so we looked in these rocks up here for a bunch of those conodonts. We dissolved something like 30 samples. And you know what we found? Nothing. But what we did find, and this is what Zach Wistert found, is a bunch of these. This is a coprolite. This is fossilized poop. And if you look carefully at it, this is a scanning electron microscope image of a structure that's smaller than the period on the end of the sentence in the Catalyst magazine. These are actually conodonts. These are crushed up conodonts that were eaten by some other fish and pooped out. So it turns out if you look in these rocks for conodonts, you're not going to find them. If you look for poop that's made up of conodonts and then you break the fossilized poop open, you find these. These are all the conodont elements which can be named and identified and figured out their age. They're also useful for chemistry. And so sure enough, that was this path to success for dating these rocks. And so it turns out that this allowed us to put a bunch of unpronounceable Latin names next to our section here. Come on, you guys know that Latin names are unpronounceable, right? You know, you're reading a scientific article and you see Latin and you just go hop to the next one. Hop, hop. And then, therefore, we will use the following equation, hop to solve for blah, blah, blah. There are certain things that just, even scientists, we skip, right? Unless you're really in that subfield. You skip the Latin, you skip the scientific nomenclature, a few other things. But in any case, some of us do read these. They're very useful for telling time. And people have gone around the world and established a zonation for different types of conodont fossils from the lower, middle, and upper Devonian. We're going to focus in on that interval in there. And so we were able to finally place these rocks in time and know where was theoretically the boundary of the sort of end Devonian event in these rocks. And it should be right up there. So another tool, you know, as a detective in deep time, you don't want to just use one tool, right? You want to use multiple tools. In fact, if I'm sitting on a scientific stool, I want there to be 3 legs, right? So I want at least 3 different lines of evidence to be used to kind of determine, hey, everybody, there's a mass extinction there, super exciting, right? Well, what's your evidence? Oh, well, we find these like kind of crushed up conodonts and some poop. That's not very convincing. You want more than one line of evidence. And as scientists, we're always looking for that. So the equivalent of the iridium layer or shock quartz at the KPG for the Devonian time is this weird geochemical excursion called the Hagadorn event. And it's a time where in the world's oceans, the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-13, which are 2 sort of flavors of carbon, like carbon and carbon dioxide, where those 2 ratios get really out of whack. And if we look at that ratio throughout time through the world's oceans by grinding up limestones, people have kind of figured out, if you will, the tree ring curve of carbon isotopes through the Devonian. In fact, they've done this through all of Earth history. And if you were to look at rocks that were 50 million years older than this, or 50 million years younger, or anywhere in between, there's only one place in all of Earth history where carbon isotopic excursions get to +6 or +7, a very extreme ratio. And that's at the end Devonian event. So in a way, that's another fingerprint for this moment that's been documented at places all around the world. And we thought, man, let's go see if our rocks have those. So it turns out someone's already done that. Dang. You know, you get an original idea, and this has never happened to you guys either, right? Every time you're like, I have this great idea. No one's ever done it before. Oops. Well, it turns out Justin Strauss and Paul Myro down at Colorado College had already done this. This was in Justin's thesis, which he later published. And they indeed had found this huge, almost like +6 carbon isotopic excursion right at the appropriate interval in the Dyer Formation in Glenwood Canyon. But again, we thought, well, why don't we try to see and document this in a couple other places and see if we can tie it to the actual fossil record, because they hadn't actually collected these samples with conodonts to date the rocks or with fossils to figure out how the fossils respond and the environments respond to these. And we thought, let's try to do all 3 things in the same place at the same time and have a really sturdy stool, if you will. So we did that. We measured a bunch of rocks. This is a discombobulated diagram showing vertical columns of rocks that we measured. We took 1 billion samples. We described all the incredibly boring sedimentary structures and microfossils and things that I'm not going to talk about today. But at the end of the day, we went to 5 different places to try to document this extinction, and here's what we found. So I'm going to show you this diagram in a couple of ways. This is the succession of rocks that we just looked through, so the Dyer Formation's right in here. This gray band is the sort of extinction interval, the Hagadorn extinction. Its global standard is actually in Iowa, go Iowa, and where they've documented by the way, the dashed line is 0, so anything to the right of this is positive, where they documented this very large excursion. And sure enough, we documented the same thing at Monument Lake. Here's 0. This is +7. Actually, that was the highest value ever recorded for the Devonian. We documented it in Glenwood Canyon, at Bison Lake, and at Bearscat Creek. So we found this again and again in all of our outcrops. And the beautiful thing is that every one of those dots on there, we also collected data to date the rocks using conodonts, and we also censused all the fossil assemblages and the environments in those same places. So we could now tie this extinction event to Colorado and figure out, well, what happened in Colorado during this moment in time? What was it like? Was it a very bad day with dark skies, or was the water really cold to go scuba diving so you wouldn't want to go in? Or what was it like, right? And I don't think I have enough time to talk about all of that, but we still only have 2 legs on our stool. We have chemostratigraphy, or carbon isotopes, as a way to know where we are in time, and we have biostratigraphy through those conodont animals that maybe they ate potato chips, maybe they didn't. So a third leg on that stool is another isotopic system called strontium isotopes. And strontium is an element that is common in volcanic rocks, like the rocks that are at the bottom of the ocean and rocks that are in the Rocky Mountains. And when they weather away and they break down, that strontium works its way into rivers and streams, into the oceans. And the ratio of strontium in sediments, and therefore then in rocks, changes gradually through time. And people have gone throughout the world and created, if you will, a strontium curve, just like a tree ring record, for Earth history. And one of the distinctive elements in the late Devonian is a very negative excursion. And so we went and documented the strontium isotopic signatures of our rocks. These data points are plotted in yellow here in these little stars. And I'm going to show you the global record here in a moment. So I've taken our data. This is data from Colorado, this curve right over here with that big negative excursion right in the Hagenberg. Here's the same data point over here with this big negative right here in biostratigraphically the right place documented from other places in the world. And so that gave us a third line of evidence to suggest that indeed we did have the signature of the late Devonian event preserved here in Colorado, both from chemostratigraphy from strontium isotopes, from carbon isotopes, and from conodonts and associated biostratigraphy. So that's really exciting, and we're almost out of time, and I know you probably have a lot of questions, but I thought it'd be fun to give you a little vignette on how did Colorado change before, during, and after this event. So I showed you a little bit about what Colorado was like based on the rocks in this sequence, but what I didn't share with you was what we missed. And I know that when you guys go out to find extinctions or really remarkable events in the field, you go right up to the thing and you're like, boom, here it is, I'm gonna study it, right? We didn't even know where that interval of time was in these rocks, right? 12 years ago. Now we know where it is. Well, we went back just in case we missed anything. And I know you guys don't miss very much in the field. Just in case, we went back to this interval and said, let's look really carefully at this zone where this Hagenberg event is and see if we missed anything. Are there any fossils we missed? Are there any structures we missed? Well, we missed some things. One of them is this weird clotted surface that we call a gooey lagoon. It has these unusual blob-like clots of sediment, in many cases with fossils entombed in them, not unlike the concretions that are in the After the Asteroid exhibit. And these are surrounded by sedimentary structures that indicate a really shallow water depth, almost as if you might have been, glopping your way through the mud in this Devonian lagoon. And that surface only occurs at one horizon in the sequence, and it occurs right below the Hagenberg interval. The other thing that we noticed we missed is these kind of lumpy things in the outcrop here. And these lumpy things, we initially had thought, well, maybe the rocks are tilted or they'd shifted, they've had a bad day, who knows what. Maybe they're just crinkling their brows. But these lumpy things are actually called stromatolites, and they are layered microbial buildups where slime, if you will, is growing on the seafloor, layer by layer, building up sort of domes or in some case little teepee-like structures in the lake. And why should you care about slime? Well, it turns out that in really deep times, slime is really common. In fact, for some of you, it's common in your bathtub, right? It's all around, or your college refrigerator, right? Microbes grow everywhere. And if you kill most of the animals that graze on them or disrupt the seafloor where they're growing, what happens? The slime, the bacteria are still around. So they make big buildups that we call stromatolites in geology. And it turns out that they're common to see right after major mass extinction events in marine settings and in lakes. And sure enough, right after the Hagenberg extinction or the Hagenberg event, we were able to find stromatolites only at that horizon, not just in this section here, but in 4 or 5 other places in the flat tops. And so Colorado went from goo to extinction to slime. I think I'm going to stop there, and that's it. That's it. There's your second mass extinction in Colorado. So thank you.
Of course, we have time for questions.
I came across a paper in grad school that we had to read for class, and I can't remember the authors, but it was about the Devonian mass extinction, and they had looked at the extinction and speciation rates across that event, and had kind of come to the conclusion that the extinction rate isn't elevated in that interval, but the speciation event is reduced. So I guess for the audience, like it's not, according to their results, a ton of things weren't going extinct, no more than usual, but because very few new things were evolving, it was still a dramatic reduction in biodiversity. So I was curious as to whether you read that paper. I'm vertebrates, so I have no idea what to think of it, and whether, like, what you think of that idea and maybe how it relates to your work, if relevant.
Okay, now do I get to talk in the box too, or no? I guess I'll stay on this thing, or the cube rather. That's a great question. So the short version is we don't know. One of the things that literally has happened in the last 2 years is that, and I should add 7 years before that, 2 things have happened. One, people have really been working on improving the geochronology or the dating of rocks together with the fossils that are in these sections. And so for a long time, we've known that the end Devonian event is really a paired extinction event, right? All right, someone's coming. They didn't like that answer. The other thing that we've learned, though, is that the Devonian Carboniferous boundary moved 2 years ago. It moved to be defined by this moment right here, right? The third thing I would say, so I'm going to answer your question, but I'm not going to answer it directly. The third thing that we've learned is that sea level is yo-yoing up and down at this time. And so the net effect of that is that organisms that can't physically move or swim away or fly away, like reefs and everything on them, they can't escape when sea level lowers, right? And they get exposed to rainfall and the air, right? Or subaerial exposure. So the latest part of the Devonian is sometimes called the age of the end of reefs, right? Or the die-off of reefs. It's the largest kill-off in reefs ever in Earth history, except for the one that's happening right now, right? Which is actually something to think about, right? Like think about coral bleaching, because we also had warming at that time. So there's a few compounding factors in answering that question, because the timing, our understanding of the timing of these events has gotten a lot better just in the last few years, right? Like the Devonian standard that I showed you from Iowa, that was published 2 years ago, and it was in a thesis 4 years ago by an undergraduate, by the way, so, which was an awesome thesis. So is that sufficient?
I think so.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't show you, actually here, I'll just show you this just for fun. So here's a plot. These are just gooey lagoon pictures of these weird things in there. But one of the things we did was we described environments in here using a lot of microscopic sedimentologic clues. And I'm going to show you this. Just key in on this section here. So the extinction's here, gooey, slimy. Don't worry about what the dots mean. But the short version is that we can plot a sea level curve through this based on rocks in Colorado, and no one's ever done that in the mid-continent before, Colorado, Kansas, Wyoming, because people don't think about doing that in the mid-continent. They do that on the coasts, right, because you have more accommodation space. So in a couple of sections, we were able to sort of point to right in here. You also have a major lowering of sea level. So these are weird terms for, let's say, deeper water, shallower water. So very shallow water and exposure, right? And so one of the compounding factors is that you're also losing a lot of data when you have exposure because you're not preserving fossils and rocks, right? So a lot of your record is being removed, right? And as I showed you, remember the sand that was working its way into wedges into that rock? That sand is doing that right here, where at the top of the section, where there's also a major lowering of sea level. And so it's a tough question to answer because, like, we're losing rock and fossils, and everything that's immobile is basically dying, right? Or let's say not being replaced and dying, right? As you said, the rate of origination was reduced. And then what's interesting is this is what the isotopes tell us too. What I didn't talk to you about today is I told you that really positive excursions were really weird, right? And that's very unusual. Well, it turns out that really negative excursions tell you something too, and they tell you that there was a subaerial exposure event, and that's because rainwater has a different chemistry, and like river water has a different chemistry than ocean water, and we can read that in the rocks by looking at the chemistry of the minerals and the fossils. And so those also show us that there's like a major environmental perturbation happening there. So who wants the cube next? Hit me.
So how do the stromatolites in the post-extinction part of the section compare to those that are lower in section, whether it's earlier in the dire or in the parting or even lower?
That's a great question. The next stromatolites that are older than that in the section are from the early Ordovician, and so that's roughly 150 million years earlier. And comparing stromatolites from 150 million years apart is challenging to do. So, but if you actually saw them in the field. You saw the Kleintop member of the Manitou Formation. Those are the next stromatolites that you see in Colorado. Colorado only has over 600 million years, there are 4 intervals in which Colorado has stromatolites in it. One's in a lake in the Green River Formation. One's, let me do it backwards. There's one in the Manitou Formation, which is also at the end Ordovician extinction, really bad time, subaerial exposure, lowering of sea level. The second time in Colorado's history in the last 500 million years where we have those slime reefs is the one I showed you just a moment ago. Don't worry, I'll get to 3 and 4 eventually. Don't worry, I won't use just the middle finger one. Gotta be careful with this one. This one is actually right after the Permo-Triassic extinction. And those rocks are next to the liquor store in Morrison, Colorado. If you want me to give that talk, I'll give that one. But that's Colorado's 3rd major mass extinction. And then the last ones are in a lake. And they're in the Green River Formation. So, yeah. Hit me.
No thanks, I'm good.
Okay.
These rocks are in the Rocky Mountains. Why are they so flat? Like, what's up with their tectonic history?
Okay. So most of Colorado has been flat for most of its time, but when there have been continental collisions, rocks get lifted up, right? And that's sort of the general story. And that's happened to us 3 times in probably the last 1.5 billion years. Once about 1.1 to 1.4 billion years ago, which those rocks aren't really preserved anymore. The second time is when the ancestral Rockies formed, and most of the rocks along the Front Range get crinkled up and then eroded. And then the third time is when the Rocky Mountains came up, and that was about 65 million years ago. So ancestral Rockies were about 350, 300 million years, depending on where you go. The rocks that are in Glenwood Canyon are a little bit like the Colorado Plateau, which is sometimes known as the Four Corners area, and that there's and actually like Table Mountain over in Golden, and that there's a huge frosting of volcanics that covered the top of it, called the White River Volcanics, that both prevented it from being eroded, but also helped keep it structurally intact in recent times. And that area, kind of like the Four Corners area, which is also to geologists known as the Colorado Plateau, let's see, how should I say this? Didn't experience direct collision like the coasts did, like California and so forth, and it also didn't experience another kind of deformation that occurs when slabs of continent get subducted and then come up and cause volcanism and things like that. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's the sort of general version, yeah. But it's one of the 3 areas in Colorado that basically have flat-lying rocks. Glenwood Canyon, the White River Uplift area, North and South Table Mountain, old rocks, I should say, and then the sort of Four Corners area. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by, I guess, the lower coffee pot, where you had not a whole lot of macrofossils, lots and lots of pieces of conodonts.
Mm-hmm.
And this is suggesting to me that you had some very, very effective, efficient carnivores that ate the heck out of whatever they could get.
Yep.
Where are the pieces of the efficient carnivores?
That's a $64,000 question. I don't know. I don't know. One of the things, like many things in science, we don't know. One of the things that I didn't tell you on this slide here is that if you showed these conodonts to a conodont worker, they would kind of curl their nose up. They'd be like, ew, do I have to work on those? Those are kind of grubby looking. These are, have you heard the term Lilliputian, or sort of smaller scale things? A lot of times in restricted environments or environments that are tough to live in, like bays or estuaries where the salinity and the turbidity of the water is changing a lot. It's a tough place to make a living. So some animals manage to thrive there, and plants, and some animals just barely eke out an existence, right? And they may not grow to full size. So a lot of the conodonts, like these, which came out of poop like that, are actually not very big. They don't have a high diversity of shape and form. And so I still don't know the answer to your question, but one hypothesis might be that, well, maybe there just weren't that many conodonts and there weren't that many predators that live there, but maybe they swam in then now and then, ate these, pooped them out, and exited, right? But at the end of the day, we'll probably never know. So, but after the Permo-Triassic, you see the same thing. You see the dwarfing of fossils. Sometimes you see more malformations and deformities in them in these tough-to-live-in environments. And you see it in microfossils, you see it in macrofossils. I don't know about the vertebrate or the terrestrial record, but in the marine record, you see that, even within like protozoans and algae. So, anyone else for the cube?
It's really fun to catch.
All right, well, thanks for coming, y'all. Have a great day.